Bedouin Press presents 7 and 7, a globe-hopping memoir of disaster and discovery, written by Sven Michael Davison and performed by Sven Michael Davison. Continent 3, Asia, Indonesia, December 19th through 31st, 2004. I spent 3 months convincing Gudrun to date me. I'm a sucker for exotic women, and her raspy Danish accent was sexy, like a mashup of Deborah Winger and Marlene Dietrich. She was 5'8" and a faux blonde with green eyes. She was direct and abrasive, and with these personality traits, I figured she would never play games. A problem I'd had with other girls. She was also a bit cold and aloof, but I wrote this off as behavior of someone who had been wounded one too many times. Gudrun and I had struck up a friendship at Fox and had remained friends after she left. When I finally won her over, we had spent a wonderful 6 weeks in passionate infatuation. After that, we stuttered through several months trying to reignite the initial magic, but we were caught in a whirlpool of our own making. I drove her crazy with my frugal ways and periodic depression. She drove me nuts with her expensive taste and inflexible opinions. We blamed our negative emotions on work stress. Gudrun pitched a Singapore trip to me. We would be visiting her family and take some side trips alone to Phuket and Indonesia. I suppose we both thought this could be our ticket out of relationship limbo. I happily took time off from work and purchased my plane ticket to Singapore. Gudrun wanted to book the rest of the trip closer to the date. I was not used to this, since I believe pre-planning means fewer headaches down the road. But in the interest of being a good partner and rekindling our romance, I acquiesced. We chose to travel at Christmas time because business was relatively slow for both of us, and her eldest nephew would have a long break. After we landed in Singapore, I began to push to solidify the rest of the trip. Fine, we can fly to Phuket on the 26th, but we don't need to buy tickets now. We can show up the day of departure and get them. Trust me, I've done it before. Was it my imagination, or were her green eyes glowing with anger? The first time I had witnessed this look was when an American had labeled her a Swede. According to Gudrun, Swedes were people who took the ferry to Copenhagen, got drunk, and fell asleep in the gutters wrapped in blankets of their own vomit. From the Viking point of view, Danes were at the top, the Swedes and the Dutch second, Norwegians and Finns don't even count. I just can't believe they don't fill their flights in advance. I was repeating myself, but I feared that if we made no plans, the most I'd see of Asia would be the inside of her sister's condominium. When I'm immobile, I begin to hear the sound of a clock ticking. I begin to think of all the experiences I am missing. Conversely, Gudrun relished downtime and liked to lay around watching TV or reading a book any chance she got. As someone who has imagined his own death on many occasions, I am constantly reminded that my time here is very short. This is Singapore, the second smallest country in the world after Monaco. No one travels the day after Christmas. Even when she was annoyed with me, I still enjoyed listening to that husky voice and her accent. I wondered if Gudrun had had the rasp before she started smoking as a teenager. I pondered her statement about Singapore's size. I was skeptical of her facts, but I didn't have a smartphone or access to a computer. Today was Tuesday, December 21st. We were 2 days into our vacation, visiting her sister, her brother-in-law, and their 3 sons at their Singapore home, and we were getting along as well as an athlete and a poison ivy jockstrap. I respected the fact that Gudrun's first priority was to see her family, but we had booked 2 weeks here, and we had discussed romantic getaways to Phuket in Indonesia months prior. "You're antsy," she sighed, and looked down 14 stories at the building's elaborate courtyard swimming pool. The pool was divided into 3 parts, and looked like the body of a guitar without the neck. The hole in the soundboard was a jacuzzi. "I want some time with my sister. Why don't you go exploring?" I opened my mouth to protest, but she was right. The idea of hanging around the condo another day when there was a strange new world outside did not sit well with me. "Go." She turned to walk out of the room. "I feel bad." She stopped at the doorway. "That's so silly. We're both getting what we want." She left the room, and I heard her speaking Danish with her sister. I felt guilty for going out alone, but we had spent the last 2 days with her sister and her family. I had a job that demanded 14 hours of my time every day, and I was so busy that I rarely found time to take a piss. If I blinked, this vacation might be over. Every second was precious. Granted, Gudrun's concept of an ideal vacation is shared by most people I have met. They prefer checking into a 5-star resort, lying by a pool, and getting a massage. To me, this sounds more like slow torture, the antithesis of a vacation. My philosophy on travel is to experience something new. If I'm going to spend money, I'm going to spend it on a crazy experience, something exciting or dangerous. Life is too short to waste lying on a towel under the beating hot sun. I have to be moving at all times. I have to be learning and exploring. Life is a collection of experiences, and I want to embrace them vigorously, with open arms. 20 minutes after my conversation with Gudrun, I exited the condo building with my camera slung over my shoulder and queued up for a cab next to the chain-link fence that hemmed in the massive residential complex. A 10-story high bridge arched over the river that separated Gudrun's family abode from the main financial center of Singapore. My cab took me over this bridge into a spotless environment filled with gleaming skyscrapers spreading away in every direction. Everything was clean and new and reminded me of how cities in America might have appeared in the 1950s, when life was prosperous and there was a feeling of community. Then again, in Singapore, the penalty for spitting, chewing gum, applying graffiti, or littering was a fine, caning, or both. There was an extra incentive to keep everything looking pristine. As I explored, I came across an old 11-story building undergoing reclamation by nature. Its whitewashed walls were pocked with gray mold. Each story had an eave that ran along the entire length of the building, true to the aesthetic of its colonial-era design. Many of these shelves supported green vines. 2 healthy saplings grew from the north tower. It was incongruous in such a pristine and well-kept city. A man noticed me studying the building. It used to be a hospital. The man, though Asian in appearance, had a British accent, but it was abandoned 10 years ago. Everything is so new around here. I'm surprised they haven't torn it down. The man nodded. It dates back to colonial rule. Some want to preserve it. Others want it torn down. It's been through the hands of a couple of developers. I'm sure its fate will be decided soon. Judging by the decay, it'll be swallowed up in another 20 years, I replied. The man shrugged. That's the jungle for you. It devours everything from temples to tanks, tigers to termites. I thought of the massive Teotihuacan and Aztec cities I'd seen in Mexico. How many might still be hidden under hills of green growth? If humans left Singapore and came back in 100 years, would they see any signs of civilization? Or would they be buried under roots, leaves, and animal dens? I spent some money to explore the Sri Mariamman Temple, a Hindu place of worship with other Asian influences. Like the city outside, Mariamman's temple walls were pristine, well-kept, and perfect. There were hundreds of intricate carvings of gods and scenes from Hindu texts on the pagoda-style roofs, onion domes, and columns. Each sculpture was painted in bright colors and fine detail. Plain walls were painted white, which helped draw attention to the highly detailed carvings. From a distance, the carvings were visually busy, but when I looked more closely, it was amazing how much action was packed into every square foot of detail. Everything in the temple was without blemish, and that disappointed me. If there had been portions of tarnish or signs of age, I would have felt like I was walking through history. The older something is, the more I am moved by it. To walk through a place and feel the presence of 100 generations of humanity walking the same footpaths before me is exhilarating. That feeling was missing for me in Mariamman, and for that reason, it did not resonate with me. I appreciated the craftsmanship and beauty, but it was all too new. The more I explored Singapore, the more this feeling persisted. I realized I felt an absence of human connection because it was too near and clean. It all looked like it had been finished the day before I landed. Age, wear, and tear represented the human soul to me. They reflect experience, character, and wisdom. I realized I would not be getting that feeling on this trip unless Gudrun and I hopped over to a neighboring country that had some ruins to explore. That's not to say I was unable to appreciate Singapore. This new cosmopolitan city had more cultural diversity than any comparable place in the United States. Large population of Chinese, Indians, Indonesians, Koreans, and Europeans lived and worked here. The street signs were often written in several localized languages, addressing all these nationalities. Eventually, I stopped trying to find ancient things and started enjoying what was unique about Singapore. I wandered around and stared at the shiny new architecture. A lot of buildings pushed the envelope of design and function, including one enormous municipal building that consisted of a network of metal triangles placed together to form 2 domes, connected by an aluminum-framed glass atrium. Walking around the domes, I found that they were uneven on the top, and one looked like someone had taken a large bite out of one of them. I later found out the building was nicknamed the Durians. Durian is an Asian fruit with a spiky green yellowish skin. Inside, it is bright yellow-orange and smells like a rotting corpse. Once in a while, I'd pass a place that sold durian, or I should say, I could smell a place that sold durian from at least 2 blocks away. The odor is incredibly pungent. I had been told that if you get it past your nose, durian was quite good. The first time I caught a whiff of the fruit was shortly after Gudrun and I had landed at the Singapore airport. I used the men's bathroom, and the man standing at the urinal next to me reeked of death. At first I thought someone had died in the restroom, but as I walked away from the man, the aroma subsided. I later learned that durian could stay with you for roughly 24 hours. The stench comes out of your pores, urine, and feces. It is a snack you definitely want to share with your date if you plan to see them again. I left the durian building and spotted the national mascot of Singapore carved in white painted concrete near the main port. The mascot is a half fish, half lion called the merlion, and this one is over 20 feet tall and sits on a pedestal of blue tile that has been laid to look like an ocean wave. The giant merlion perpetually vomits a stream of water into the bay. About 20 yards behind it is a much smaller version that faces a concrete staircase. It keeps its back to its larger brother. As I continued along the waterfront, I came across 12-foot Fernando Botero sculptures that seemed to litter the pedestrian walkways by the man-made shoreline. All were made of bronze, and every naked body was incredibly round and balloon-like. Despite their mass, I kept thinking a strong wind would be able to rip them from the ground and send them floating into the towering skyscrapers beyond. It rained for most of the day. As I wandered along the harbor, I imagined the same landscapes 100 years ago. It would have been all mangrove and jungle. Would it be again? Human life is short, and each of us lives in a snapshot of geological time. How different the world would look if we all lived 1,000 years. The change would be incredible. Then again, it would be so overcrowded we'd probably start killing each other wholesale, unless our reproductive cycles slowed down with our aging. I had lived in New York for 4 years, and the humidity was equal to Singapore's, but this city smelled better. New York always had a wet, metallic smell to it that mixed with the odors of pretzel cart, charcoal burners, urine, and rotting garbage. I did not see any garbage or smell any urine here. I returned to the condo in time for supper. I expressed my desire to see something historical to Frederick, Gudrun's brother-in-law. It just so happens I have a membership to the Tangling Club. Frederick winked. It's the oldest and most exclusive club in Singapore. One of its most famous members is Nicole Kidman's father. Gudrun jumped in. He's joking. The club costs $30,000 a year and Maersk doesn't pay him that well. Gudrun's sister laughed. But we do belong to the Singapore Club. It dates back to the 1880s. We're going there tonight. Gudrun's twin nephews were left with the live-in maid, while Gudrun, her sister, Frederick, Hans, Gudrun's 7-year-old nephew, and I all piled into the family car. Frederick drove us over the bridge and into the city. As we pulled up to the Singapore Club, 2 Sikhs dressed in white colonial uniforms and matching dastars opened our car doors. The Singapore Club's exterior was white and lush with jungle landscaping. I imagined it had remained relatively unchanged during the past 120 years. The interior had white walls and high wooden ceilings that glistened with black lacquer. Swing fans hung from the rafters. They swayed back and forth by means of long belts connected to small electric motors. The interior was so immaculately perfect that I felt like I was visiting Disneyland instead of a historical landmark. Then I saw a sign for the establishment and realized I had been played. Gudrun's family had taken me to the Raffles Hotel. Still, the place had a 120-year history, and I enjoyed imagining the international officials who frequented this place over the decades. We ate appetizers and drank Singapore slings. The cocktail reminded me of sour fruit. I checked it off my bucket list and decided I would probably not have one again. I'm more of a whiskey or beer fan. After appetizers and drinks, we headed home, and everyone went to bed except me. I had an agenda. I sat down at Frederick's computer and booked 2 tickets to Phuket on Singapore Airlines for December 26th. Our plane took off at 6 a.m. and we'd arrive at 8. I paid extra for trip insurance and tickets I could cancel. I had an excited skip in my step when I found Gudrun awake and reading in our room. We should be at our hotel in time for a nice brunch. I lay down next to her and gave her a kiss. Phuket is so incredibly romantic. I want to experience it with you. She sighed and put her book down. I'm here to see my family. Why can't you just be with me and my family? Honestly, I feel like I'm doing both, except for today. I've been with your family since we landed. The next morning, I spent a few hours playing with her 7-month-old nephews. By 10, I went out for a 6-hour stint in the city. I stopped by Frederick's office to check out his view. He had a huge office with glass windows looking down at the Singapore port, the busiest in all of Asia at the time. Dozens of massive cargo cranes and freighters stretched out to the visible horizon. A foggy mist swallowed the port in the distance, but I was able to count 62 cargo cranes. I wondered how many billions of dollars were down there, hidden in all those steel boxes. This was Singapore's lifeblood, the primary generator for their economy. It was impressive. Frederick's office had a 4-foot-long model of a blue Maersk freighter laden with cargo sitting under a giant lucite box. The model was just as impressive as the view outside the windows. I stared at the detail and wondered who had made it. Was it manufactured, or had an artist been commissioned to build it? It was made by a model maker in Denmark, Frederick told me when I asked. Beautiful work. It took him over a year to finish it. Is it yours? I asked. No, the company's. I thanked him for his time, and he went back to making phone calls. He reminded me a bit of myself. He spent most of his waking life in a glass box, engaged in business and oblivious to the gorgeous view outside the window from his ringing telephone and constant emails. I exited the Maersk skyscraper and wandered farther inland. With the clubs and dozens of other establishments, Singapore still held on to much of its British colonial identity. The Brits obviously had done something right in this part of the world if the locals were willing to preserve the evidence of their old rulers. I passed an elderly Asian man pushing an ice cream cart. His larder contained durian ice cream sandwiches. I purchased one. As the man pulled out the paper-wrapped square, I could smell the scent of rotting corpse mixed with a tad of citrus. I bit into the sandwich. It was sweet, cold, and creamy, with the pungent taste of rotten flesh. I swallowed 2 bites before ditching it in the trash. No matter how much sugar and cream you put on a corpse, it's still a corpse. The following day was Christmas Eve, and Gudrun spent the day preparing and cooking the family's traditional duck. The live-in maid usually cooked every meal and cleaned on a daily basis, but the duck was Gudrun's specialty, so its preparation was off-limits to the maid. The maid was Indonesian, and she had a family back home. She was on call 24/7 except Sundays, when she had 4 hours off. I had asked Gudrun's sister if that was normal for Singapore. Yes, she spoke with the same Danish accent as Gudrun. Most families take advantage. We pretty much leave her alone after 7 p.m., and many times I make the breakfast. The apartment where the family lived was constantly air-conditioned. It was a 2-story loft design with 3 bedrooms and a master upstairs connected by a balcony that looked down on the living and dining room. There was also a guest room and bathroom on the first floor in the addition to the kitchen. The living room and dining room were framed by 2 stories of glass with sliding doors that opened onto a balcony. The ceiling in this area was over 30 feet tall. The maid's area was accessed through a door in the back of the kitchen. Her room was composed of unfinished concrete and was without heating or air conditioning. It had only 1 window. I could not imagine a building leaving unfinished rooms attached to each unit, but it was apparently commonplace in Singapore. Most homes had maids' quarters, and those quarters were Spartan at best. How does the pay compare to what you could make in Indonesia? I asked the maid when we were alone in the kitchen. She barely spoke any English. Better than home. What about your room? Better than home. I have more space, clean. I miss my babies. How old are your children? 4 and 6. I couldn't get much else out of her. The language barrier was too great. After the Christmas Eve sunset, everyone put on Santa hats and sang Danish Christmas songs. Most of the melodies were unfamiliar to me, but some were the same. We ate Gudrun's duck and opened presents. Several family photos were taken, and I was included in a few. I picked up one of the 7-month-old twins and walked him to sleep. The maid had the other in her arms. After both boys had been placed in their cribs in their parents' room, I joined the adults for glasses of wine. Everyone crashed around 9 o'clock. When Gudrun and I were finally alone in the guest room, I asked, "Do you know what you're going to pack for Phuket?" Gudrun sat on the bed in her nightgown. "I can't stand all this pressure." "What pressure?" I could barely disguise my frustration. "I've been entertaining myself for the past 3 days." "You've hardly hung out with us." "I hang out with Hans and the babies every day." "You're too antsy. It isn't working out. I think we need a break." I stood at the foot of the bed, dumbfounded. "You're breaking up with me?" "Yes." "I can't believe this." I stared down at the courtyard swimming pool. It was Christmas Eve. The closest family I had was over 5,000 miles away. It was probably 80 degrees outside and humid. The cabs ran until 10 p.m., and the streets were safe enough if I wanted to venture trying to find a hotel. This was turning into one Christmas I would never forget. "Okay, I'll pack." She grabbed my hand. "Don't be silly. You don't have to leave." I pulled my hand away. I was really getting tired of her calling me silly and antsy. She stepped out of bed and walked to the door. "There's a guest room down the hall. I don't want to wake up your sister to get it set up." "It's already set up." My anger spiked. "You planned this?" "I wasn't sure I'd go through with it until now." "Why didn't you do this a week ago before I got on the plane?" "I thought the trip would change things." "I love you, Gudrun. Can't we work this out?" She shook her head. "It's late. I'm not going to wake anybody up over this. I don't want to argue." "That's convenient. Do you want to stay the night or not?" I looked out of the window and then at my watch. It was pushing 10 p.m. I had no interest in walking over the bridge into the city and trying to find a place to crash. I wanted to kill Gudrun. At the same time, I wanted to win her back. I'll stay. She walked me to a room at the back of the condo that was filled with cardboard boxes, where a little twin bed that was made up rested against the wall. It was clearly a storage room that Gudrun and her sister had prepped for me. I got the feeling the bed was in here for storage too, not to accommodate guests. "This is special," I muttered. She had the nerve to kiss me on the cheek. "Good night." With that, she turned toward our room, closed the door, and turned out the light. After logging onto Frederick's computer to cancel our plane tickets to Phuket, I went to bed. I spent most of the night tossing and turning. What I wanted more than anything was to sleep and forget it all. I also had the urge to sneak out, book a flight to anywhere, and take off. This trip was supposed to have been a way for us to settle down and work on our relationship away from the pressures of our jobs. All that had changed now. I decided I would be available to talk if the opportunity presented itself, but at the same time, I was going to enjoy my vacation no matter what. When the sun revealed itself on Christmas morning, I got dressed and wandered downstairs to stare at the Christmas tree with no presents underneath it. I thought of all the times I had woken up in my childhood home in Colorado. We had a scraggly 6-foot artificial tree that looked a lot like the one from A Charlie Brown Christmas. It was ugly, but it always had presents underneath it on Christmas Day. Now I was in a house that had different traditions, in a city that never saw snow, where English was a second language, and I had no close friends to confide in. I couldn't even call anyone without asking permission from my hosts, since the call would be pricey. To top it off, there was a 3 o'clock Christmas party planned by Gudrun's sister for all the Danes who lived and worked in Singapore. I'd have to put on my best game face and pretend to be happy and cordial. "Merry Christmas!" Gudrun came down, sat on my lap, and gave me a French kiss. Did I dream last night? No. Her morning voice sounded even more hoarse than her daytime one. I slept like shit. Me too. I was confused, yet electric with the possibility that she was coming around. Maybe she did want to make this work. "What do you say we leave tomorrow?" Did I hear her correctly? Are we getting back together? I spoke one word with hope in my voice. "Phuket?" "Bintan. It's a 3-hour ferry ride from Singapore. It's in Indonesia." I was hoping for Phuket. She swung off my lap. "Maybe you should go exploring again today. I'll help with getting ready for the party. Just be back by 2, before the guests arrive. You want to talk?" She shook her head. Singapore on Christmas Day was just as busy as any other day. All shops were open for business. Most people in the city were working. Was it my imagination, or did I see fewer European faces in the crowd? If so, that was the only difference. It was wild to be in a country where Christmas was about as important to the locals as Diwali, an October Hindu festival of lights, is in America. Outside of Gudrun's family condo, I saw one Christmas tree the entire day. I made my way to a temple that boasted the largest statue of Buddha in all of Singapore. It seemed appropriate to spend Jesus' birthday at a place of worship. This Buddha was housed in a 3-story structure a few miles north of the harbor. It sat next to a black and gold Chinese temple that was about half the size but twice as ornate. 2 traditional Chinese lions stood at either side of the entrance to the temple. The Buddhist temple was made of smooth white concrete and had huge, cartoonish-looking lions on either side painted in yellowish gold. They looked like caricatures of the lions adoring the temple next door. I paid to go inside. The interior was vast and open, with a white marble tile floor, and at the back of the room sat the 3-story tall Buddha. In front of him were 2 low shelves and a center rack, all covered in little Buddha statuettes. Big Buddha sat in a lotus position wearing a yellow tunic. He had a calm expression, but his sheer size made him a bit intimidating. An image of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man from Ghostbusters popped into my head. I chuckled to myself when I pictured Buddha tearing apart the condo where I was staying and swallowing Gudrun whole like a twisting insect. I returned for Christmas dinner with the Danish expats. I had a few lovely conversations, but felt a chill from Gudrun and her sister. I started drinking early so I could project an appropriately jovial persona. We woke up before dawn so we could make it to the harbor on time. Perhaps as a concession to me, Gudrun's sister had called the night before to be sure there were seats available on the ferry to Bintan. The person on the other end of the phone assured her that there were plenty of seats on all boats headed out to the Indonesian island. Frederick dropped us off. A dozen sleepy people milled about the terminal, including 3 employees and us. I could not imagine the ferry company was making any money on this run. I attempted to engage Gudrun in conversation, but she was doubly grumpy because of the early start and the lack of a second and third cup of coffee. Plus, she was unable to light a cigarette due to the public smoking laws in Singapore. The sun did not come up until we were a good hour out to sea. Gudrun was able to smoke on deck and buy some coffee at the ship's cafe, and so was a little more pleasant, but she remained unwilling to discuss any of our relationship issues in detail. The sky was gray and the air was thick and damp. After the ferry docked, we stood in a short line to apply for a temporary visa. The immigration officer took our applications, printed our visas, and stuck them in our passports. Just think, I thought to myself, if Gudrun hadn't dropped the bomb on you, those tickets wouldn't have been canceled. You'd be getting into a cab in Phuket and driving directly to the beach. You and Gudrun would be walking hand in hand on the beach enjoying the surf in less than an hour from now. What I didn't know was that just an hour after my visa was issued, an earthquake would strike to the north, causing tsunamis that would wipe out over 300,000 lives. The waves would tear apart the beaches in Phuket and extinguish 100,000 souls on the north side of Sumatra, whose landmass I could currently see from Bintan's port. But Bintan itself would remain untouched. Want to talk? I asked Gudrun as we rode a bus to the Bintan Resort Hotel. I marveled at the jungle outside the window and the monkeys running across the road. About what? Breaking up with me. I mean, why are we here? You said you wanted some time together alone. You wanted to get out and see Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Yeah, but I was thinking in the context of a romantic relationship. We are in a relationship. She pushed her sunglasses up and nestled into her seat as if she were going to take another nap. We're friends. I felt like my head was about to explode. I searched for the emergency exit. Dude, she's not worth the effort. We checked in and took a stroll to the beach, where Gudrun promptly grabbed a lounge chair so she could sit and read her book. It was slightly overcast, and there was a steady breeze coming off the water. It was not a good day for tanning. I stood for a few seconds looking at Gudrun, then back at the stack of lounge chairs. Really? We traveled thousands of miles to go to a resort and read a book? There are monkeys here, venomous tropical snakes, mangroves, and a million other cool things you'd never see in Los Angeles or in Denmark. And now we're here, in some sterile environment filled with manicured lawns and engineered bungalows removed from the real indigenous culture. Gudrun gazed up from her book and saw my perplexed expression. This is my 4th trip here. I've seen it all. You go ahead. I'd rather read. You read my mind. I shuffled on down the beach. The resort faced south, away from the nightmare that was unfolding for thousands of people just 400 miles to the northwest. I put all my effort into stuffing my emotions down in order to enjoy this tropical paradise. I closed my eyes and listened to the surf and the wind in my ears. The sound of the ocean filled me with calm. There was something primordial about the ocean. All life sprung from it. It was vast, powerful, and intimidating, and yet it made me feel like everything was going to be all right. A few hours later, and after considerable prodding from me, we took a tour of the local mangrove swamps. The sky remained overcast as we boarded a steel canoe with a tiny outboard motor and puttered down a long, placid river. The shore on either side was lined with thick vegetation, all of which was supported by a 4-foot-tall platform of skinny gray roots. These were the mangrove trees that separated salt water in order to stay hydrated. How fun it would be to shrink ourselves and our boat down to the size of a mouse and navigate that root system. The network seemed infinitely vast. Our 5-foot guide, dressed in khaki shorts and flowered shirt and purple life vest, spotted a red-headed black craic curled up in the branches of the mangrove tree. These are very venomous. They stay sleeping during the day and hunt at night. From our vantage point, the snake looked like a blob of coiled black sea kelp wrapped tightly around the joint of 3 tree limbs. Gudrun leaned toward me. So much for the moonlit walks on the beach. I almost spoke my mind aloud. I'd rather spend my time with the snakes on the beach than the one in our room. That night we had dinner in the hotel restaurant. We passed the tourist desk, and I spotted a pamphlet advertising the chance to swim with dolphins. How about it? I suggested to Gudrun. She picked up a flyer for a massage. This is more my speed. We each bought our own events for the next day and headed up to our room. Any interest in a moonlight walk? I smiled, thinking she might key into the trepidation about snakes she had vocalized earlier in the day. I'm tired, you go ahead. I laughed to myself. She was really making an effort to keep her distance. Is she here out of guilt? I didn't know or care. Well, I did care, but I didn't want to. I left the bungalow and hit the sand. The ocean roared, the wind blew hard. Large palm fronds dropped from the swaying trees. The resort looked a little more like a jungle and a little less like a resort, and I loved it. I made my way onto the beach, where I seemed to be the only one out enjoying the weather. A family of monkeys skittered across the sand and climbed up a tree, silhouetted by the moonlight. I closed my eyes and stood in the wind and sound of pounding surf. The more I listened, the more I felt connected to the world. That connection to something so much larger than me made me feel calm and safe. The effort to be with Gudrun was a strain. and there were times when I felt nothing but anxiety. But right now I felt at peace in the heart of the howling wind. The next morning I got up and took another walk on the beach. Gudrun and I had a quiet breakfast together. When my bus to the dolphin encounter arrived, I skipped aboard like a schoolboy. The further I moved away from the resort and Gudrun, the lighter my heart became. The world outside the resort was an enlightening contrast. Every town was densely populated. People were everywhere. The homes I saw were mostly grass shacks, though I spotted a few concrete bunker-like buildings for the more well-to-do. I wondered how many of the structures had plumbing. We passed a school made of concrete that had no glass in the window frames. I spotted a monkey perched on a windowsill, staring intently at the class inside. I saw very little evidence of money or modern infrastructure. The towns on Bintan were a striking contrast to our resort, and especially to the gleaming skyscrapers of Singapore. The dolphin reserve was a tad depressing. A dozen dolphins swam in 20 by 20 steel cages submerged in the harbor. I felt guilty giving my money to this cause. Shouldn't these wonderful creatures be free to swim in the wild? As the pens were opened and the dolphins swam in the netted area away from the harbor traffic, each tourist was assigned a trainer. Mine was a wiry little man named Tran, who was originally from Vietnam. He was all of 5'1" and looked like he didn't weigh more than 90 pounds. Tran and I got into the water together, and he guided me on how to pet Dolly, the dolphin I had the privilege of getting to know that afternoon. Dolphin skin is sensitive, so it's important not to scratch them with your fingernails. Tran also showed me how to work with Dolly and reward her with a little dead fish after each stunt we performed. My favorite stunt was to tread water with my legs locked behind me. Dolly would dart off into the water and swim back, placing her nose into the arch of my foot, then push me as fast as she could. With her powerful tail behind me, I was a human speedboat. I had so much fun that I completely forgot about my life outside of that moment. After an hour with Dolly, the tourists and trainers had lunch together next to the dolphin pens. I struck up conversations with a few of the trainers. Most were from Indonesia or the nearby countries, and all had stories of a hard life with little opportunity. This was one of the best jobs they had landed. When tourism was down, everyone suffered. Then we began talking about how the dolphins lived, and I got depressed again. My money was basically paying for their prison. The dolphins got to spend 2 hours per day training, and when the tourists came, they had another hour free of their cages to roam the netted area. At all other times, they stayed in their pens. I suppose it's possible the dolphins feel that they've got it made, being walled off from danger and having food brought to them every day, but a cage is a cage. Seeing these beautiful animals herded back into their tiny pens as we left crushed my heart. I had a brief fantasy of sneaking back here at night and setting all the dolphins free. Now that would be an adventure that I could go home and brag about, provided Indonesian police let me out of jail before my 70th birthday. I returned to the Bintan Resort Hotel with only an hour to pack up and head back to the ferry. When I stepped into the hotel lobby, Gudrun was waiting for me. I packed up everything. She pointed to our bags. "You just need to check out." I couldn't help thinking that what she really meant to say was, "Thank God you got back in time to pay the bill." As I handed my credit card to the girl at the front desk, Gudrun walked up to me. "I was just watching the news." I turned to her. "What was it?" "There was an earthquake. Sounds like there might have been a tsunami." I craned my neck to see if I could glimpse the TV in the lounge. "Really? Anybody hurt? Sounds like a few hundred people in India died." Jesus. We caught our bus, followed by the ferry. It wasn't until we were on our way that the crew turned on a few 12-inch sets mounted to the aluminum ceiling frames. Footage of a wave hitting a hotel in Thailand played on a seemingly infinite loop. When we got back to our sister's place in Singapore, we saw the real devastation. Indonesia had been hit hardest, and yet the news we'd seen there was showing nothing of their own tragedy. We also heard that Phuket had been wiped out. Gudrun's sister was kind enough to offer the use of her phone so I could call home. I let my parents know I was safe, but didn't give much detail since Gudrun and her family surrounded me. My folks were very relieved that I hadn't gone to Phuket, as I had originally told them I planned to. During the next few days, I spent most of my time with Gudrun's nephew Hans. I took him to a jungle park, went swimming with him, and entertained him as much as possible. Gudrun and I remained less than cordial companions. We took a day trip into Johor Bahru, Malaysia. Getting there was incredibly straightforward. We simply boarded a bus, drove across the bridge connecting the north side of the island with Malaysia, and walked through customs. We strolled along the Johor waterfront, which looked out onto the jungles of Singapore. It had been raining, and the air felt thick with the dense smell of peat. As we walked, we heard the midday call to prayer echoing from a white mosque with a blue tiled roof. We visited the Istana Bisar Palace, which was near the mosque. The Sultan of Johor had had the structure built in 1866. The palace was very well maintained and reminded me of museums back home. It was old, but not quite old enough for my desire to see something ancient. I wanted to get my deep humanity fix to help me distance myself from Gudrun's presence. I wanted that feeling of calm again. I wanted that sense of belonging to something bigger than myself. "Do they have any ancient ruins around here?" I asked Gudrun. "This isn't old enough for you?" "Don't get me wrong, it's beautiful, but I was thinking of something along the lines of Angkor Wat. Then you should have booked a trip to Cambodia. Had I known what I know now, I would have done that." I winked. Gudrun ignored my comment. "Well, there's nothing that I'm aware of, and this is my 4th time here, but old stinky temples aren't really my thing either." Remember this lesson well, Sven, I thought. Never travel with anyone who doesn't share similar interests. You'll wind up with an endless compromise, and both parties will be unhappy. We took a quick, self-guided tour of the palace, which felt very European inside, with its oil paintings of life during the Sultan's time. Then we exited the palace and strolled into the city. The skyscrapers were not as modern as the ones in downtown Singapore, and there were many sections where there were piles of rubble mixed with garbage between the buildings. I noticed a unique way the Malaysians had of getting rid of eyesores. We came across one spot where a huge billboard had been built in front of a rotting 3-story wooden apartment building with warped gray boards and tin roofs. Small air conditioners were attached to open windows. Laundry hung from glassless windows, and garbage was strewn all over the grounds. The billboard had been constructed to block the entire building from view. Gudrun and I both had to use the bathroom, so we entered a large 5-story building made of unfinished concrete. Gudrun had been here before because it was a home to a large shopping mall. We found a restroom inside, and I passed a man sitting at a folding table who sold 5 squares of toilet paper for a couple of pennies worth of local currency. I had no need for them, but down the hall, the woman sitting at her table in front of the ladies' room was busy selling paper squares. I entered the men's room. The facilities were filthy, in need of a hazmat team armed with bleach-filled fire hoses. I breathed through my mouth and emptied my bladder as fast as humanly possible. "How was your bathroom?" I asked Gudrun when we met in the hallway outside. "Disgusting, but better than the ones you find off the street." After a few more hours exploring the streets of Johor, Gudrun and I were ready to leave. We had to show our passports and then board a bus to get back home. Once the bus was full, it passed through a checkpoint before it rode over the bridge and back into clean and spotless Singapore. I celebrated New Year's Eve with Gudrun's family. We went to a cafe on the beach that had 20-foot walls stuffed with fish tanks that were inset floor to ceiling. I was encouraged by the staff to go around the room and pick my fish, which they'd cook one of several ways. I chose a crab cooked in a pot of boiling butter and pepper. It was the best crab dish I've ever had. After the sunset, we drank champagne in the condo. Our plane departed for Los Angeles at 11:30 p.m. on December 31st, and we arrived home at 6 p.m. the same day. Gudrun spent the entire flight with her back turned to me. We shared a cab home since we lived 2 blocks from each other, and an hour later I joined my friends for a New Year's Eve celebration in L.A. When my mother later told my grandmother what had happened in Singapore, my grandmother commented, "That breakup saved his life. He should be thanking her." As the death toll grew over the weeks to come and the extent of the devastation caused by the tsunami became clear, I realized my grandmother was right. I also felt very small and shallow for focusing on my own woes when there was a much larger human tragedy occurring almost in front of my face. I wanted to be bigger than the sum of my emotional issues. I wanted to be a positive force of good in the world. I decided I would strive to be a better person every day. I would strive to be more compassionate and understanding with anyone I encountered. Eventually, I did thank Gudrun. I told her it was the best breakup I had ever had.